Many years ago, in the sweltering summer of '76, I was living in North Hollywood. Money was scarce, so I squatted in an abandoned block of apartments. The bottom had fallen out of the real estate market, rents were high, and there had been a lot of foreclosures in the area. My story begins with the events that occurred over one night in July. My name is Carrie Eveline Anderson. This is my story written from my notes and diary entries taken one fateful night. The terror that was inflicted on me will never leave. My mind now is a troubled one for which there is seldom relief. Do not judge me, I'm not deranged. I just need help to get me through the night every once in a while. Is that so bad? The dive I was in was at the top of a high-rise. You could see the huge letters of the famous Hollywood sign from my window. If you turn your head just a little more, you would also see the Griffith Observatory. For those living under a shell, that's where the observatory scenes were shot in James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause. As dusk drew, the horizon was ripped apart by an orange-crushed sky. The ragged mountains cut the skyline from end to end. With thin lips pursed, I stood in wonder at the magnificent views over the city of angels. Of course, there is another reason why I lived in the squat, but I never tell people about that. Some years before, when my brother was around, we were driving out on Ortega Highway 74. It was supposed to be a weekend away with a group of friends. My brother Ethan owned a Shelby. It was his pride and joy. We were just cruising the winding roads, playing it cool, heading to Lake Elsinore. My friend's father had an old wooden cabin there. Suddenly, a freak rainstorm came upon us. When Ethan turned the bright lights on, something rapidly ran into the road and stopped dead, turning its body in our direction. It looked at me and growled. The car skidded sideways, tires screeching in an attempt to avoid the creature. We zigzagged and swerved before the car flipped into a verge at the edge of the woods. It was then that I saw the thing properly. It wasn't too big, 3 feet tall or so. It had 2 small arms with 3 claw-like fingers and stood on 2 almost reptilian hind legs. Slowly, it moved towards us. It then lunged, making the weirdest clicking noises. There was a god-awful cry as it went in the upturned Shelby. The last thing I felt was its hot, lurid breath before it savaged Ethan, shaking its head side to side like a rabid dog as it ripped his flesh apart. It came around to my side of the car, but maybe it had its fill. All it did was brush past me. Its coarse hair were like bristles. I peeked at it as it went by. It stopped and chomped its elongated jaws before climbing on the underside of the car and crying into the night sky. I don't know how long it was, but it seemed a while or more. I put my hand to my ear, cupping it to listen for any sound of the creature. Nothing. Dead silence except for an owl hooting. I thought I'd chance a peek. I gripped the underside of the car, snagging my nails as I eased my way out of the wreck, mournfully looking over at Ethan. A somber mood had come over me, but one thing was clear. I was in a real mess. I checked his pulse, beamed, and punched the humid night's air. I softly spoke. "Can you walk, Ethan?" He was still in shock and said nothing. His face was marred, so he'd be scarred for life, but he would live. The full moon glowed as I slung his arm over my shoulder, following the yellow lines in the middle of the road. Ethan was too heavy for me. I was only a small girl and had to stop every once in a while. I spoke to Ethan, not expecting a reply, but it was of comfort to me. "I think that was a Chupacabra." Ethan raised his drooped head, looked me in the eye, smiled, and dropped his head again. Empathetically, I said, "Look, I'm telling you, man, swear down it was." Up yonder was the Ortega Oaks candy store. Although it was closed, we could patch up on the porch. The best thing I could do was make a call to my friend to come and fetch us back to Los Angeles. In the coming weeks, Ethan was never the same. He began to become very aggressive towards me. I still loved him though, but every day he got worse. His health deteriorated at an alarming rate. His wounds, however, healed in the most part, but it seemed to be a mental thing. I tried to get him to leave the apartment, but he refused and would not leave the room. He stayed in one squalid space all day, cowering in the corner, afraid of his own shadow. He was a wreck, a shell of who he once was. He'd twitch and fidget. You know, he actually sounded more like an animal than a man now. I was at my wit's end now about what I should do. I had troubles of my own. In the later days, I had started using morphine to ease life's burdens. I was going crazy, and it had all gone to my head. Over the next week or so, I began to get all his basic requirements sorted. What I mean is, I had a plan. It was diabolical. Thinking back now, I don't know what possessed me. I searched the apartment block for what I needed, an old, manky mattress and buckets in the squat below. I crept in the room while he was asleep. I softly shuffled to where he slept, his lair, I now called it. I tethered him with a chain like an animal. He snorted and stirred, his hairy eyelids opened. I saw its blood vessels pulse, then the creature rolled the whites of its eyes and fell back into a deep slumber. It would be the longest night I ever had. Well, at least that's what I thought at the time. I began boarding the door up with timber. I smashed floorboards, furniture, pallets, and an old wooden crate down. I nailed the animal that Ethan had become into his lair. He was no longer human anymore. I would attempt to keep the creature fed and watered until it died or withered away. Then I would forget the memory of him forever. I believe the thing Ethan was turning into was a Chupacabra. It was tethered and seemed to wake up slowly at night. Things went on like this for years. I'd get shopping trolleys left by local youths. They'd pick them up at Safeways and dump them at the abandoned apartments. For what I needed, they were perfect. I'd scavenge every evening before the sun sets for roadkill, strays, and drunken vagabonds. Roadkill was best. Strays and vagabonds became a messy affair. As time passed, I could proficiently gut any creature you care to put a name on. Just down the corridor from where I sleep, there is a room that if you approached would faint due to the vile stench. The old chipboard door was rotting. I gave it a lick of paint and cut strips of polythene as a bit of segregation. Polythene sheets were put down on the floor, and it helped clean the mess up after the butchering. The place swarmed with flies buzzing around. They'd settle on the meat, feed, and lay eggs. When I'd carved the bodies up, I would put the meat into buckets and go feed the creature. On the door, I had devised a shutter. I never went in unless I had to. What I did was hammer the meat with the back of the cooking utensils to soften it up and get it nice and bloody. It seemed to perk the animal's attention. Its nose twitched searchingly. The smell of fresh blood drove the humanoid crazy. It disgusted me what had become of Ethan and myself. If only the Chupacabra had not bitten him that night. One evening, I watched it feed on a vagabond's cadaver. I noticed it sucked blood from the strewn body till it was drained dry. Then it ripped him apart in such a manic frenzy, I hurled. The wide red eyes caught mine, and then came that blood-curdling death scream. I'm not ashamed to say it, but it chilled me to the bone. It was at that moment that I decided I had to kill this thing. My plans were to say my farewells the next evening after the monster was done feeding. Then I would blow its brains out and take it out of its misery. It would end both of our suffering. That day I went to the library and decided to read about Chupacabra some more. The book said it fed in a vampiric way, draining the blood from its meal. Over the years, many animals such as goats, cattle, and other livestock have been found with puncture wounds on the neck. Apparently, Chupacabra means goat sucker in the Spanish tongue. The creature can be found throughout the Americas. My name is Carrie Eveline Anderson, and I swore that day that I would kill the cursed monstrosity.